Ladies and gentlemen, we will now begin panel 1 of our conference. The panel is entitled History as Infrastructure. Does the Northern Tier have a shared past? I would like to hand over the proceedings now to MEI's Director, Professor Eng Seng Ho, who will be chairing this panel.
Thank you. Welcome back from coffee break, everybody. At the opening round table, we essentially started off with a very contemporary situation. And of course, in my opening and in Serkan's opening, we discuss the broader agenda, which is both the contemporary and the historical. And across both the contemporary and the historical, it is the geography, which is the constant. With this panel, we will jump backwards into the history with the geographical constant and have another go at it and in a fully historical way. We are happy to have Professor Masha Kirasirova, who is with us. She's not sitting here, but she's sitting in NYU Abu Dhabi. And we are grateful to her to be up here with us. I don't know what time it is, but it is very early for her, 7 o'clock. So thank you for setting your alarm clock early. So Masha Kirasirova, I think, we can see her there, I can see her. Okay, here, great. And we have Professor Sabri Atesh, who is with Southern Methodist University in Dallas. He will be speaking next. And then we have Dr. Dawood Moradian, who is coming from the Afghan Institute for Strategic Studies in Kabul. He will be the final speaker on this panel, and we'll have time for discussion. So I won't take into your time. Please, Masha, will you please start? Thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Yes. All right. Thank you very much for this kind invitation. I'm actually in the United States right now, so I'm not even in Abu Dhabi. So it's you just missed the fireworks. They finished up for the 4th of July, about half an hour ago. I was hoping that they would go on during my presentation, but so the title of my paper is, the paper is about institutionalizing the East across the divide of 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution. And I'm trying to think about the geopolitics of Russia's West Asian frontier. So after the final phase of Russia's imperial expansion in the late 19th century, its West Asian frontier came to be seen by European and American scholars of geopolitics as representative of Russia's wider global ambitions. As the president of the Association of American Geographers, Ellen Churchill Sample suggested, Russia's making history on a pattern set by geographic conditions. For her, from mostly the southern province of Transcaspia, conquered just 25 years ago, she's writing in 1911, Russia is heading towards the Indian Ocean. And as evidence of Russia's drive to the sea, Semple cited the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907, which she claimed yielded to Russia all of the northern Persia as its sphere of influence, enabling Russia to advance halfway to the Persian Gulf. And Semple's contemporaries, like working and theorizing geopolitics, like Halford Mackinder and Alfred Mahan, also drew on social Darwinist and geographical determinism to represent Russia's expansion into West and East Asia as evidence of its wider global hegemony and its despotic nature. So in an influential article on the persistent factors of Russian foreign policy, historian Alfred Reber has shown how many of these late 19th and early 20th century theories of geopolitics gained widespread acceptance in the post-World War II Anglo-American international relations, surfacing in debates over Soviet foreign policy and in the works of highly placed advisors like Isaiah Bowman and George Kennan. As Reber concluded, European geopolitical ideas even held some sway in Russia, especially in shaping how certain educated circles understood the effects of geography on colonization and conquest of the Great Eurasian Plain. But as my paper will argue, this West Asian and Central Asian frontier proved equally significant for Bolshevik geopolitical thought and practice in a very different way. And it suggests that the Bolsheviks' engagement with this West Asian, Central Asian space illuminates a different persistent factor in Russian foreign policy. So on the eve of the Bolshevik seizure of power, the future of the international state system seemed uncertain. Lenin had, by 1917, authored a number of works on international relations, including the famous Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And he had prepared a plan for ending World War I with multiple contingencies. He hoped to expose the war's imperialist nature by publishing secret treaties of the Allied powers, and then calling upon the peoples of the world to force their governments to make peace. If that failed, he predicted that the continuation of the war would only bring revolution in Europe 100 times nearer and put the Bolshevik government in a position to lead an army of workers and peasants in a new revolutionary war. And in this war, the government would be in alliance with the workers of developed countries of Europe and the oppressed populations of colonial and semi-independent Asian nations led by national revolutionaries. And to achieve this alliance, Lenin understood that he and his government would need to confront this rising tide of nationalism. In 1917, however, the Bolsheviks did not yet possess a coherent nationalities policy. What they did have, as Terry Martin has argued, was a powerful slogan which they shared with Woodrow Wilson, celebrating the right of nations to self-determination. But national self-determination had been already at the crux of debates about colonialism in the Second Internationalism, although in these debates it was not yet linked, the colonial dimension with the national one of cultural and territorial autonomy of nationalities within the empire, as Lenin and Stalin would come to do. And some of the international and domestic dimensions of this nationalities policies were pursued separately. So, for example, at Lenin's insistence at the Sixth Party Congress held between the two revolutions in 1917, the Congress recognized the rights of the peoples of the Tsarist Empire to secede and form independent states. And then in late 1917, the Commissariat of Foreign Affairs began to publish treaties signed by Russia during the war and renounced all special privileges which the Tsar's government had obtained. But there was a linking of this national and colonial question, which occurred in the often cited Appeal to the Muslims of Russia and the East, which was issued on December 7th, 1917, by Lenin and Stalin on behalf of the Council of People's Commissars. And as historian Ronald Suny has argued, this appeal's powerful rhetoric of self-determination, liberation, independence, and anti-imperialism finally established a unity of the struggle against colonial and national oppression. But this unity remained uneasy because by addressing Muslims instead of any other available Marxist socioeconomic category, Lenin and Stalin were addressing an active political group in Russia at the time. This Muslim political organization was the product of centuries of Russian imperial government practice of granting or restricting the rights and privileges of its subjects according to their denominational affiliations. So that by the early 20th century, the state's encouragement of its Muslim subjects in running their civic affairs enabled the Russian government to effectively institutionalize Islam under its secular authority. And after the February Revolution, the first one, the provisional government took up this very powerful instrument from Russia's imperial toolkit. In March, the Duma called a conference of Russian Muslim leaders in Petrograd, which elected a 28-member Provisional Central Bureau of Russian Muslims. In April 2017, another Muslim Congress met in Tashkent to discuss the matters of import to the Muslim community of Turkestan and to elect delegates to the first All-Russian Muslim Congress in Moscow. And at the All-Russian Congress in Moscow in May 2017, over 800 participants gathered to discuss, among other things, the future of self-determination. And they concluded that the interests of Muslim peoples in Russia can be a united federal republic based on territorial autonomy. Although the Bolsheviks renounced Tsar's practices and tried to distance themselves away from it. They were also operating in a socio-political space that was produced by centuries of Tsarist government. So like the provisional government, they also initially approached the Central and West Asian borderland through the sectarian lens. A January 1918 decree created a Central Commissariat of Muslim Affairs with a special Central Muslim Military Collegium, which was responsible for organizing Muslim troops to fight on the red side. In Turkestan, the Commissar of the Sovnarkom, Kabozov, formed a Central Bureau of Muslim Communist Organizations of Turkestan, known as the Musbureau, to propagate Bolshevik ideas among the indigenous populations and to establish party organizations within it. Yet this sectarian framework proved very unwieldy as a foundation for world revolution. The Musbureau had a special section for international propaganda, which was subdivided into Arab, Persian, Turkish, Azerbaijani, Bukharan, Kyrgyz, North Caucasus, Kalmyk, Chinese, Korean, Japanese, and Indian sections. And other official Muslim organizations received a similar mandate to link Russia's Muslims with those abroad, especially in the immediate periphery. But tensions arose when Muslim national communists within the Russian Communist Party, headed by Sultan Galiev, took a more radical view on the question of self-determination. Sultan Galiev agreed with Stalin that world revolution could and should be perpetuated beyond the borders of the Tsarist Empire to the oppressed Muslim peoples of Asia. Yet he envisioned that in order for the Islamic regions of Middle Volga, the Urals, the Caucasus, and Central Asia to become leading exporters of revolution, they would first need to be fully independent Muslim states. Stalin, of course, disagreed. As historian of international relations John Jacobson has argued, the appeal, in the 1917 appeal to Russian and foreign Muslims, already contained the seeds of a bifurcated national colonial policy in Asia. The Muslims of Russia, the proclamation stated, would be granted cultural autonomy under the protection of the Soviets. Meanwhile, the Persians, Turks, Arabs, and Indians that it explicitly referenced were encouraged to fight for political autonomy by driving out the European imperialist robbers and the oppressors of your countries. And by 1918, Stalin had also proclaimed the slogan of the right of national self-determination to be outmoded and argued that it should be subordinated to the principles of socialism. In 1920, he went further to say that the demand for the succession of border regions from Russia must be rejected, not only because it runs counter to the very formation of the question of establishing a union between the center and the border regions, but primarily because it ran fundamentally counter to the interests of the mass of people in both the center and the border. So the Muslim Bureau, the Musbureau, was disbanded, and in 1925, Stalin made this bifurcation more explicit, juxtaposing a Soviet East where imperialist oppression had been overthrown against a foreign colonial independent East. So while they were correcting this course, Stalin and the other Bolsheviks shifted their language to address not Muslims now, but Easterners. This began, as early as 1919 in an article in Pravda. Stalin talked about our tasks in the East as raising the cultural level of backwards peoples, building a broad system of schools and educational institutions, and conducting Soviet agitation, which would then allow Soviet power to become near and dear to the enslaved peoples of the boundless East. The same year, the Musbureau was renamed the Bureau of Communist Organizations of Peoples of the East, like I mentioned. The newly established Third International, the Comintern, was an Eastern section was created within it with a mandate to help with communist organizations outside Europe and North America. The Comintern organized the Congress of the Peoples of the East in Baku that mobilized over 2,000 delegates from the Caucasus, Central Asia, Turkey, Iran, India, and other regions. And by the early 1920s, the Commissariat of Foreign Affairs also had its own Eastern section. But as I want to suggest, first of all, this shift also was, it was revolutionary, but it was also a way of substituting one imperial strategy for another. Although Imperial Russia never had a colonial office on the model of Britain and France, its foreign and domestic politics were organized along Eastern and Western, or with Eastern and also sometimes Asian lines. So already in the 18th century, the Russian Collegium of Foreign Affairs had a secretary for Asiatic correspondence, for example, which employed translators for Oriental languages and instructors of Oriental languages to provide in-service programs for education for future diplomats and bureaucrats. With the establishment of a formal ministerial system under Alexander I, a foreign ministry was also created with an Asiatic section to deal with areas of the world outside of Western Europe. That came under the province of the ministry's chancellery. And during Russia's expansion into the Caucasus and Central Asia, an imperial general staff also had an Asiatic department where military Orientalists were increasingly worried about Russia's overreach in Asia and the lack of expertise to support it. And so these Eastern departments were all ones that were responsible for managing Russia's certain borders during this period of expansion and erosion of the sovereignty of neighboring states, including the Ottoman Empire, the Emirate of Bukhara, the Khanate of Khiva, and others. So they were responsible for negotiating this shifting border. So Russia's Central Asian frontier was therefore a case study not just for theories of geopolitics among the Anglo-American scholars of international relations, but it was also critical for early Bolsheviks trying to create a new anti-imperialist world order while preserving the territorial integrity of the former Russian Empire. And after 1917, we see that this pattern set by geographic conditions, which the geopolitical theorists described in Central Asia and the Caucasus, acquired even greater significance than it had under Tsarist rule. And in their scramble to institutionalize an Eastern policy and negotiate tensions between the domestic politics, diplomacy, and this call for world revolution, the Bolsheviks shifted their approach in Central and West Asia away from Islam and towards this more amorphous East. And while revolutionary, this shift also represented a shift of two imperial strategies. And the resulting bifurcated anti-imperialist policy in Asia would shape Soviet ideology and practice for many decades, representing another factor in Russian foreign policy that persisted not just along the revolutionary divide of 1917, but can also be observed in Cold War operations like the Soviet Operation Kavkaz called Kavkaz in Egypt in the late 60s, early 70s, and then can arguably be observed even today in the Russian embassy's tweets of images of Grozny, which is part of the domestic East, as a viable model for what might be desirable in Syria, in the foreign East. Thank you very much for.
Thank you very much, Masha. I don't know if you were here during the opening roundtable, but you've certainly taken some of the themes and issues which came up there into a historical realm, but also geographically more expansive way. We next have Sabri Atash, please.
Can I move there?
Of course.
Some tech problems. Stand up. First, let me start by thanking Dr. Ehsan Guho and his team, Serkan Yolachan, Hoda Al-Junaid, and Sharon Kong, and Mr. Alatas, the names I've been in contact to. It's really a wonderful opportunity to be here, and thank you for having us. Now, what I want to do today is, again, taking a cue from Dr. Friedman, start with a joke at the expense of our guests here. I really like the notion of samovar, growing up with a samovar, and always thinking it's a Russian invention. I wanted to concentrate in my talk on the little teapot that goes on the samovar, which is forgotten here. So that's why here I am. But taking the joke and the metaphor a little further, it also reminded me of the teapot or the bottle that the genie comes out of. And I want to concentrate a little bit on the genie that I hope never comes out. And that genie is topic of my talk, the historical relations between Iran and Turkey. Now, when, as many of our previous speakers mentioned, Iran and Turkey are cooperating with the big brother watching, Russia out there. And this is one of the anomalies of the Syrian war. This is happening despite their pursuit of very different agendas. Turkey is supporting the jihadist groups, some of them at least, who consider Iran a neo-Safavid entity, deceitfully trying to finish what the first two Shia revolutions, that is Safavid revolution of 1501 and the Islamic revolution of 1979, failed to do so. That is establishing a Shia hegemony in the Middle East. Iran, as we know, is a supporter of Assad. So, but through the mediation of Russia, they've been cooperating. No doubt, this owes a lot, of course, to the presence of the United States, the other big elephant that we need to mention here when we talk about Northern Tier, its presence in Asia. But the other thing that I want to draw attention, of course, among many other things that our previous speakers alluded to, one other thing that brings Iran and Turkey together is their shared antagonism towards the Kurdish demands in the larger Middle East. Both of them are severely limiting political and cultural rights of their Kurds, and they watch every Kurdish movement with suspicion. And this became very clear in their cooperation against the referendum movement in Iraqi Kurdistan, and also Turkey and Free Syrian Army's occupation of the Syrian district of Afrin, which was done through the blessing of Russia and Iran at the same time. Now, these developments brings to my talk, put a kind of temporary break on the very anti-Iran, anti-Shia rhetoric of some of the columnists, especially in the newspapers like Yeni Shafak, which is one of the mouthpieces of the government. And for some time, the government mouthpieces were trying to convince the people that the end game of Iran and its Shia minions is to dominate the Middle East, conquer Mecca and Medina. So with their new Ottoman hubris in full swing, the sons of Ottomans, of course, were not going to let this happen. But to many observers' surprise, this is happening. Now, as a historian and as the confessed and professed pessimist of this workshop and life, I want to bring to your attention the historical ties that might make this cooperation in the long run problematic, the genie part of the samovar. And that, I think, is the legacy of history. Because a lot of people, when they discuss the Middle East, because of a Eurocentric perspective, privilege the recent history, and especially the First World War and its legacies in the Middle East. But I want to draw attention to a longer-term historical legacy, and that is perhaps more damaging to the Middle East, and that is inter-Muslim sectarian animosity, which is visible in every part of the region, unfortunately. The Syrian uprising and the destruction of Yemen are, of course, reshaping the mental map of the region. The sectarian animosity, of course, reached its climax with ISIS. In their propaganda, which we unfortunately were forced to watch, the jihadists refer to Iraq most of the times as Bilad al-Rafidain, or the lands of those who reject the path of Sunnah. And Iraq was mostly referred to as the Safavid Iraq, a reference, of course, to the Safavid dynasty that ruled Iran from 1501 to 1722. Iran, in their mind, of course, is the Safavid Empire reincarnated. Extremists, or to be exact, the armed extremists are not alone. Qatar-based influential Sunni cleric, Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, for example, a darling of some of the circles in Turkey, and the Muslim Scholars Association of Lebanon, to give just two examples, voiced similar opinions. Qaradawi issued a fatwa labeling Hezbollah and Iran the supporters of the Syrian government, enemies of Islam, and in fact, more infidel than Jews and Christians. While the Sunni clerics of Lebanon urged their co-sectarians to support the Syrian Sunni rebels, lest the Safavi project spread. And similar columns, if not as direct, if not as obvious, were taking place in some of the presses, unfortunately, in Turkey. Now, this is part and parcel of a strand of politics, what historical sociologist Charles Tilly called a repertoire of contention. Now, what I mean by that, like a script that is played over and over by the theater troops, such fatwas, declarations, and acts that follow share common characteristics that are put into the service of political actors time and again. The danger of overturning long history of secularization of interstate relations, because that's the story I want to tell you about, that the history of Ottomans and Iranians started from basically a war of religions to a very secular relationship. And what I want to draw attention that there is a danger that this will be upended. This will be overturned. Now, let's make my points clear by going back in history. And with a particular focus on religion. Now, Ottomans and Safavids started their political careers at around the same time, 1300s. One as a worldly dynasty, one as a religious brotherhood or network that will, over a period of 200 years, evolve into a dynasty. The evolution of the trans-regional Safaviya Sufi network into a militarized band of warriors and its domination of Iran by 1500s is one of the most consequential political revolutions in the pre-modern global history. The Safavid leader had a messianic appeal, his followers very, very zealous, and they had a very big appeal in Anatolia. Of course, this provided Ottomans with a very grim fact that they faced, what to do with the Safavid network that might take Anatolia away from them. Now, in the meantime, Safavids start fighting religious wars to a certain extent, geopolitical but also religious wars with the Uzbeks, and Ottomans are trying to set up coalitions against Safavids. The Ottoman Sultan of the time, Yavuz Sultan Selim, which the current government actually very recently named a bridge over Bosphorus after. So, might be very historical, but he's with us. So, Selim, or Selim the Grim, as the name tells you a lot, wanted to face the Safavid challenge. What to be done? Now, Muslims are not supposed to fight the Muslims. But the question is, which Ottomans grappled with, is Iran Dar al-Harb or Dar al-Islam? That was a very long question that dominates if you read the Ottoman historiography. It's back and forth. So at this time, Iran was declared a Dar al-Harb. You can go and fight against the Iranians. And you go to the Mufti, of course, for that. Mufti of the time, during the time of Selim, was a gentleman called Hamza, Mufti Hamza, who had been warning the Muslims to be aware of the Qizilbash, or the Shi'is. Now he declared them worse than infidels and apostates, kafir ve mulhid. The Mufti affirmed that it is permissible and even incumbent upon Muslims to kill their men and divide their goods, women and children, and pronounced that any holy warrior, Ghazi, who died in this pursuit will be considered a martyr. Sanctioned by such fatwas, Selim, of course, went, and he defeated the messianic Shah of the time at a place we all know, Chaldiran, but he was not able to crush the Safavid movement, and this is very important. To isolate him, he established relations with almost all of the Sunni powers around Iran, but he used this opportunity to also go and defeat the Mamluks of Egypt. The way he did that, again, you cannot go and fight the Muslims. So what you would do, he accused the Mamluks with cooperating with the heretic Safavids. Since you cooperate with apostates, you can become a target of jihad. But the important thing about fighting the Mamluks, it gave the Ottomans Egypt, Iraq, parts of Iraq, most of Syria, and later on the remaining parts of Kurdistan as well. So Ottomans became a Middle Eastern power. Now, ruling Mecca and Medina, which was part of the operation, brought Ottomans a big legitimacy. They became the rulers of the Islam. They can claim now they are those champions of Islam. But which Islam is the question, of course. Now, this is the time, of course, the Shia zeal is in full swing in Iran. And this is what European historians define as a period of confessionalization, or Sunnization of the Ottoman Empire, Shiization of Iran. Now, for the Ottomans, Europe and its religiosity is not very important. It's the irreligiosity, as they saw, of Iran that is important at the time. Because Iran, in their mind, is ruining Islam. The others are infidels. We don't care about their religiosity or irreligiosity. But Iran is important. And this idea of Iran as a place of war was taken up by Selim's son, Suleiman the Magnificent, very famously, and the son of Shah Ismail, called Shah Tahmasp. Both of them ruled about 50 years. And Suleiman carried out 4 campaigns against Iran. All of those campaigns, of course, have to be sanctioned by the ulama. Fatwas have to be given. And most famously, there is a gentleman called Kemal Pashazadeh, who I share a profession with, a historian, but also a Shaykh al-Islam. He published a variety of anti-Shia fatwas, or an existing repertoire that goes back to the beginning of Islam. Not the fatwas, but the idea. He argued that war against the Shia is jihad, or Ghazai Akbar, which allowed for their killing and for their goods to be considered halal for the takers. In his fatwas, now pay attention to the name, Fi Takfir al-Rafaviz, which is takfir, which is declaring somebody non-Muslim, he said, once conquered, their possessions, women, and children will be considered spoils. For their men, they should be killed unless they become Muslims. Now, this idea of this repertoire will be repeated over and over. And most famously, there is another gentleman called Abu Suud. He's the most famous Ottoman Shaykh al-Islam of all. And I want to quote from him. He was asked, is it licit, according to Sharia, to fight the followers of the Safavids? Is the person who kills them a holy warrior and the person who dies at their hands a martyr? He replied, yes. It is a great holy war and glorious martyrdom. Now, while Ottomans, of course, issued such fatwas, the Iranians were not doing anything. There was very intense anti-Sunni propaganda. Sunnis were persecuted. They were moving to the Ottoman Empire. They were moving to India. Under Shah Tahmasp, official cursing ceremonies of the first 3 caliphs of Islam, his wife and his companions, were institutionalized. The Shah himself will sometimes go and interrupt the Friday khutbah in some of the mosques and will curse the first 3 caliphs and this and that. So this will become the most important topic of negotiation between the Ottomans and Iranians along geopolitical issues. Now, as I said, Suleiman carried out campaigns, 4 of them, but he realized it's not easy to use a Persian word, shahmat the Shah, or checkmate the Shah. Another solution was needed, and that solution is diplomacy. And that is what I call is the beginning of secularization of the relations between Iran and the Ottoman Empire. So they signed a treaty in 1555. What is really interesting about this treaty is the same year that the Treaty of Augsburg signed between the Catholics and Protestants in Europe. And this cannot be a coexistence. And hence it brings us to the idea of Eurasia as a place that ideas similar but in different forms traveled. Now, what is really important, Augsburg officially established the legal basis for the existence of Protestant and Catholic sovereigns in Holy Roman Empire. And with Amasya, with this treaty, Ottomans for the first time recognized the Safavid as a legitimate entity. Now, in both cases, of course, in Europe and in the Ottoman Empire, the wars or religious wars did not stop. In Europe, after 30 years of war, which religion played a primary role, the European states established what has been called, of course, the Westphalian state system. Very similarly, Ottomans and Iranians, 10 years before Westphalia, actually established their frontiers and came up with a treaty. And yet again, this cannot be a coincidence. Those ideas of territoriality, ideas of sovereignty, ideas of non-interference, idea of secularizing interstate relations became a fact. But very much like in Europe, the peace did not last too long, maybe 70 years or so, and then the Safavids were about to be gone, and Ottoman Sultan of the time, Sultan Ahmed, immediately goes to his scholars, asks for a fatwa, and they immediately inform each other. The Council of Ministers come together, the Sheikh al-Islam and his people come together. Immediately, the same repertoire of contention that I mentioned is alluded to. Immediately, the fatwas were published. But I'm running out of time. I will try to cut very short here. What happens, Ottomans and Iranians, in 1746, which also is very important in European history in a way, came together, signed another treaty, and for the first time, religion was left behind. That legacy continued in early 19th century. In 1820s, Ottomans and Iranians will fight for 2 years, then make a treaty. What is really important, in Europe, as we know, in 1815, the Concert of Europe is established. Similarly, Ottomans and Iranians established what I call a Concert of Zagros, deciding finally that frontiers will stay. Again, the connection, the developments, the networks, the ideas are there. Now, this secularization of Ottoman and Iranian relations continued. I will not bore you with the details of history. And it reached its climax during the time of Ataturk and Reza Shah. And we have a period of complete secularization. But what happens in Iran, of course, you have the revolution. And in the same year, you have a coup d'etat in Turkey. What is really interesting, the coup d'etat in Turkey starts a period when the official state policy of my country becomes Turkish Islamic synthesis. And I think that synthesis is what gave us the ruling party of AKP. If we have AKP in rule today, it has a lot to do with that coup d'etat and the philosophy it came up with. Now, what that coup d'etat and its legacy established is what I call is a period of bringing religion into politics more and more often. And this is, of course, going forward. In the 16 years of its rule, AKP wasted no opportunity to further this idea of Turkish Islamic synthesis and to Sunni Islamize the country. And we know the similar things is happening in Iran, with Iran's intervention in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, to a certain extent in Afghanistan. Iran is also pursuing a very Shia-centric strategy. So what I'm trying to bring to your attention is that this repertoire of contention, this legacy is there. And at any moment, if Iran continues its trajectory, if Turkey continues its increased Sunnization, this could become a problem. I'm not saying, of course, that there will be a war between Iran and Turkey, which I hope it will never happen. But this long history could make chances for a long-term alliance very problematic. And it is there. I'm not saying that there are no other connections that other speakers are alluded to. There is trade. There are very many networks, formal and informal, that brings those two countries together. But there is this deep, big subterranean dynamic that we should not forget. And that will be my final thought.
Thank you, Dr. Atesh, for this wonderful tour de horizon, which gives us a lot to think about. One thing I think one question which your talk brings up to me is the issue of whether categories drive practice or whether practice drives categories. And I think in your talk you gave us both sides. Yeah. And I couldn't help also thinking of this Zagros mountain axis in terms of Greeks versus Persians.
Yes.
And Greeks versus Persians, at some point there are religious similarities, and at some point they are at the opposite end. Nevertheless, Turkey, Iran also is Persia-Greek.
That's very
and,
true.
of course, you have Thucydides and the histories of the wars and so on. So basically, you have connections and you have divisions. And across this history, you can emphasize one, you can emphasize the other, or you could emphasize one and take it across the whole history. So I think we have a great laboratory for discussion here.
That's very true.
We'll move on to Dawood Moradian, please.
Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure for me to be here. You would ask question why an Afghan is attending a conference about the Northern Tiers, and where is Afghanistan part of that. And my essence of my presentation is that I challenge such categorization. Such categorization, I found it dangerous and inadequate to reflect the reality. So there is a reason why I should be in this panel. But before that, last night we had our dinner conversation. I noticed that the number of Persian speakers exceed the English-speaking participants. So I think 5 or 6 of us in this room speak Farsi. And now, since you choose a samovar, as we say in Afghanistan, as a symbol of Northern Tiers, what would be the symbol of a Pax Persiana if there would be such alliance? And I was thinking that the most important thing that can describe a Persian is a cup of wine. And wine, and if you read the Persian poetry, you cannot find one single Persian poem or Persian poetry who does not have reference to wine. So inshallah, if there is when there is a Pax Persiana, would be a wine as a symbol of our world here. So that is, so we would replace samovar, which is here. So about the title of my presentation is the myth of Afghanistan. But before that, I would like to focus a little bit on the importance of myth making in international politics. And I feel that there has not been sufficient recognition of the role of the myth in influencing international politics. That internally, in the domestic, in sociology and anthropology, there have been a lot of work on identity formations, the concept of nationalism, and on the gender studies. So there are a lot of studies on the role of the myth and construction, political nature of identity formation. But there have not been enough to study how myth influence international politics here. Whereas if one look at the history of the world, there's a continuity of the myth in influencing, shaping politics. You said about the Greek and the Persians. So the Greek and Persian, if you see that as, for example, in the gender study, we ascribe certain characteristics to women. Women have a certain biological characteristics, certain biological deficiency. Therefore, we politicize a biological construction, which is a woman's here. Also, in the race study, there are certain characterizations that one associated with black people or with the non-white people, or certain characteristics that we associated with white people. So again, that is the politicization of natural phenomenon, be gender, be race here. One also extended to a collective geography. I mean, the Persian for the Greek was not only a geography in the eastern neighbors, but it was a political construction in the eyes of the Greek. Internally, there was this Athenian versus Sparta. The Athenian were the sophisticated race, and Spartan were the warrior race here. And then we continue to the Islamic world that we have Darul Harb and Darul Islam. Darul Harb and Darul Islam were some geographical reality, but it had a kind of a political interpretation here. And then we come to the colonial period that there was this Europe versus Asia. And for European, they ascribe certain characteristic to the non-Europeans, be African or Asian hairs. And that trends continue to this world, and I think that is, therefore this northern tier I see as a continuation of that approach that you want to give a geopolitical interpretation and meaning to geography, to the politicization of a geographical space here. Therefore, one has to be careful. In that politicization or giving a political meaning to a geography, one carries a lot of prejudice and a stereotype and a lot of myth that one has to be careful. And I think Afghanistan is a good example of the power of the myth in influencing international politics here. So I mean, in my previous job, I was with the Afghan government, with the Afghan government in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and National Security Council. So almost on a daily basis, I face with the myth about Afghanistan's. Myths on Afghanistan, and I find out a number of myths that characterize Afghanistan. Again, Afghanistan is just an example of that trend. Is not unique to that kind of mindset. One is that Afghanistan and Afghan as a warrior race, and that we are very warriors, and this myth of Afghanistan as a graveyard of empire. That shows that in terms of combat capability, we have defeated all imperial powers because we are more warrior compared with others nation. Then there is a myth about Afghanistan that they are unruly people, they are tribal, unruly people that they are born on horse and die on horse here, so they are far from a civilization. Even it didn't surprise me that even in Tehran, they would ask me if there's electricity in Kabul or not. So that the image of Afghanistan, even in countries such as Iran, is that there is no electricity in Kabul yet here. So this image of Afghanistan as unruly, undeveloped. Then there is this motion of a criminal Afghanistan, that is a criminal Afghanistan that we produce opium or all kind of illicit drugs here. And there's this question of misogynous Afghans. That a friend of mine says that in London that he wanted to date a girl, and he introduced himself as, I'm from Afghanistan. The moment that girl heard that he's from Afghanistan, she ran away. This is the myth of Afghanistan as a misogynous nation. Then in terms of the geopolitical sense, we are a no-man land zone because, for example, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of countries, they are confused where to put Afghanistan. In South Korea and Japan, we are part of the Middle East barrier. But in some countries, we are part of South Asia. And in some countries, we are part of Central Asia here. So there is this confusion outside Afghanistan about the geopolitical identity Afghanistan, where you put Afghanistan here, say. And that question that I was asked, that if Afghanistan is a South Asian, Central Asian, or Middle Eastern, or West Asian countries. And everyone would answer that question differently. But again, I will give you some example of that, that those myths about Afghanistan, for that matter, about many other entities really do not necessarily reflect the full pictures. And the myths reflects some reality, because all myths are born in a reality, but not necessarily a full reflection of the reality. And I give you 3 examples about the difference between myth and the reality. When I was listening to your excellent presentation about Iran and Turkey, or Safavid and Ottoman, there's another reality, is that they were both Turkic. They were both Turkic powers here. So the Safavid, and I remember there was a letter by one of the king of Safavi writing to his Ottoman counterpart, criticizing him that why in Ottoman court they use Persian as a language. And he criticized a Safavid king, criticized Ottoman that why he doesn't use Turkic language. And the Ottoman king replied back to him that you are so backward. Why you don't use a sophisticated language such as Persian here? So therefore, even kind of Safavi and Ottoman that we see as representing of two different worlds. Now, when we see the point of the language, Farsi, that really the most important contribution to the growth of the Persian language has been by the Turk. About the Turkic world here is that in India subcontinent, this Mughal dynasty, they were the main sponsor of the Persian language. In Ottoman period, they invest a lot in promoting the Persian language here, whereas in Safavid time, really they had difficulties with the Persian language and Persian legacy. Therefore, there's always this, it's not always black and white here. The second example that, again, to show the difference between this reality label and category with the reality, I was in Israel a few years ago, and I went to Israel for kind of an unofficial visit. And I found some very interesting people there. And one was that Israeli former, that time he was the director of Israeli Shin Bet, the internal security. And we found out that he's from my town, Herat. Herat working in a very important position in the state of Israel. And in the same visit, I found that the deputy of Masjid al-Aqsa Mosque is from Ghazni. Ghazni is from the Muslim who migrated to Palestine. And so as an Afghan, I was asked this question that who I am, that on one hand the head of Shin Bet is from my town, and at the same time is the deputy of Imam of Masjid al-Aqsa is from Afghanistan. That is for me a question that I'm South Asian, I'm Muslim or a Jew. So we're kind of forcing to choose, and I didn't choose. I had tea with both of them in a different way here, so we discuss history. The third example is that in 2008, the British Defense Secretary said in his interview that we are not in Afghanistan to build a girls' school in a medieval 14th century broken tribal society. So we are not in Afghanistan to build girls' school in a broken tribal 14th century. And I had a chance to meet with him and thank him for his honesty, that I know that you are not here to build a school in Afghanistan, but your reading of Afghanistan 14th century is slightly different. And I gave him a book about Herat in 14th century. And just as you compare Herat with London of 14th century, listen to who is the tribal broken society of 14th century years. Therefore, I think this example shows that I think in international politics and geography, one has to be careful about this categorization, this label, because really they reduce a multi-layer identity into one or two layers, and the best would be that I think we recognize the pluralism of our identity. Pluralism of identity that can encompass many aspects of both religion, interests, history, language, and also power and expressions. And I think that is in a kind of a globalized world that I don't think it is helpful that we continue that trend of kind of labeling a geographical label to human interaction here. So I think, again, if one can go back to history, there is a good example that in our part of the world, we had the concept of Khorasan. And Khorasan it really does not signify any necessary geographical or ethnic identity. I mean, that Khorasan is a truly an inclusive construction, and that Khorasan, one could find a contribution of all religion or language, all community living to live together. Therefore, if you are going to find a category to describe our part of the world, I would say is that we have to move beyond a kind of a geographical concept and construction, and to have a more kind of normative construction that can be as inclusive as possible. And thank you for your attention.